Hi class, Dr. Jim here. In this lecture we're going to look at another system in which we find very important. Obviously we wouldn't survive if we didn't have this system, and this is known as the digestive system. So this is all about eating today and why, or taking that cheeseburger or apple that you had for lunch or for your snack and figuring out how it all goes through and works its way through the digestive system. Typically, when you eat something, it takes about 24 to 48 hours to get it all the way from your mouth to your anus. But in this situation, we're going to take a look at all the different parts that are involved, how you break down the food, the chemical digestion part of the system, and then look at the major organs that play a role and where most of the digestion takes place. Okay, so we're on to looking at the digestive system today. So the first thing we're going to look at is obviously what is the purpose of the digestive system, and that is to bring in nutrients into the body and to feed our cells. We're going to look at animals, and again there are two types, and you may have remembered from when we looked at the early simplistic animals that they had basically a very primitive gut and that their mouth was used for both bringing in food and releasing waste out. And so we'll look at that, and animals that are more advanced where they have the complete system, where basically they have two openings on either end, the mouth and then the anus on the other end. Okay, we're then going to take some time and look at the primary structures of the digestive system, and what I mean by primary, those are the ones strictly involved with the process and digestion of food. And then we're going to look at some of the accessory organs, or as we call them sometimes, the secondary system, digestive system, and that includes things like the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder that actually are used for secretions, but they're not directly involved in digestion and things like this. And so we'll talk a little bit about those as well. So primarily what we're going to focus in on is the tube within a tube, and that's what our digestive system is. If you think about it, our digestive system starts with our mouth and works all the way through our body to our butts. And basically we have an opening called the anus, that's where our waste is released. And so that's one giant long tube. And so we're going to look at the process of food going through that tube. Okay? So to introduce everything, we have the heterotrophs. And the heterotrophs are any of those organisms that need to eat in order to acquire energy. And again, they acquire energy through digesting. Now, it could be as simple as a cell where it brings in food particles through endocytosis, regularly called phagocytosis. It brings it in, digests the food morsel using the lysozymes, breaks it down, takes the minerals that it needs through absorption and diffusion, and then finally any waste is eliminated through exocytosis. Now that's in a simple cell. Typically when we think of digestion, we think of the human body, and so obviously involved with, again, the mouth, the esophagus working its way down into the stomach. Then you have the small and large intestine, and then again you have your accessory organs like the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder that all play a role in digestion. Okay, and so what happens during digestion? That complex molecules are broken down to smaller and simpler molecules that are to be used by the cells. Okay. Animals require energy to maintain their complex structure. Obviously, we're multicellular, and so all our cells need to eat and get nutrients to survive. And then the energy is the release of the breakdown of the complex. And so we talked about cell respiration, how important glucose is to make ATP, getting that mechanical energy and being able to do that mechanical energy so you can move your muscles. That's very important. And again, using food as a source of energy to build building blocks for larger macromolecules as well. So it's not all about using it up for energy. A lot of the food we use is to store and also to build things like proteins, amino acids, nucleic acids, and things like that for things that we need in the future. Okay, so we're a thriving community of digestion with our cells, not only using it for energy, but also for building things up as well. Okay, so what are our functions of our digestive system? Well, obviously the first thing is the ingestion of food, and so eating that slice of pizza that you might have had for lunch, that's the first thing. Okay, another thing that our digestive system does is mechanically break down food, not only with our teeth, that's the grinding in our tongue, using it to move it and mix around. We also have our stomach, which churns, and our small intestine that actually squeezes and absorbs some of the nutrients out. And so that's all part of the mechanical breakdown of food in the digestion. Okay. Another thing is the chemical breakdown of the digestive system. And again, all the chemicals we secrete. So we talk about some of the lysozymes that we secrete in our saliva, along with some of the amylases and other important enzymes that break down starch. Then we get into our stomach, the pepsin that breaks down proteins, and then we're going to get into the lipase and the other sugar molecules, sugar enzymes that are found in the intestine and all those things. And so all these different enzymes play a huge role in breaking down the food chemically as well as mechanically. So the mechanicalness of the teeth grinding and the tongue mixing and churning and their stomach churning and that stuff, the chemical enzymes that help break down these things along with the pH of the stomach help break these things down. And then absorption of the simple molecules in the bloodstream, that's really important. That's where the small intestine plays a huge role. So most of the absorption of the food takes place in the small intestine. The large intestine is primarily used for the absorption of water, and so we're going to look at that as well. And then finally, once you've finished and got everything you possibly can off that slice of pizza, eventually you have excess waste and you have to get rid of it. And so we talk about the elimination of the undigested food, and that is the feces that you poop out every day. Hopefully you're regular and you poop it out every day. As a normal human, you should have a bowel movement at least once a day. And so that would be normal and healthy. If you don't, you're abnormal and you're not healthy. A lot of times you suffer from constipation and probably some of the problems that go along with that. So again, we're going to look at all these different things today when we discuss this. I really like this picture because it kind of shows you the work that takes place inside your gut and what happens in all these things. And again, we'll talk more about each one of these specific organs here in a few minutes. All right, so there are two basic digestive systems. You can have an incomplete digestive system, which is found in very simple animals. One of the examples that we've talked about is like the planaria worm, and basically they have what is essentially a mouth and an intestine, and then at the same time that mouth works as their anus, because the food goes in, they break it down, they release the minerals and nutrients that they need, and then they expel all the waste right throughout. So basically they regurgitate all the food that they eat as waste. Okay, and that's a very simple, and again we see these in the very simple organisms. Again, we see it in the cnidaria, which are the jellyfish, and the planaria, which are the simple worms. And again, basically an incomplete system means that you have a gut, you have a mouth, and then again the waste goes out through the mouth. So the mouth has two purposes in this thing, not only ingestion but also elimination in this case. Most higher order animals have the complete system, and the complete system basically represents having a mouth and then on the other end having an anus. The mouth serves one purpose, and that's ingestion of food. The food goes through the digestive system, and then the waste is eliminated through the anus. And again, the way we think of this, again, we looked at it in earthworms. They have the long digestive tract all the way through. The mouth is on one end, the anus is on the other. You look at fish, fish have the same thing. And mammals and birds and reptiles all have complete digestive systems where, again, they have a mouth and then eventually they have an anus for the elimination of waste, okay? And that's a complete system. When you have two holes, one on one end and one on the other, that's a complete system, okay? And a complete digestive system, and most higher organisms have this type of thing. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is the structures of the primary digestive system, and again, that includes the mouth, the throat, the esophagus, the stomach, the small and large intestine. Okay? So the mouth. This is responsible for receiving and beginning the digestive process. So actually, digestion begins as soon as your saliva hits the food. And a lot of times you'll have a response to when you smell something good, or that you taste something, or maybe you've had your neighbor that brings something over, you start to salivate. You start to make more and more saliva because your mouth is getting prepared to start the digestion process. As soon as that food is put in your mouth, the saliva that you have start and attacks and digests that food particles. Okay. The other thing that you have in your mouth is obviously the tongue. The tongue is a tough muscle to help mix the food with the saliva and start the mechanical process of digesting. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the teeth and those things in just a second. But again, the two main parts, the mouth receiving the food and the tongue to help mix the food with the saliva. Okay. Now the teeth are obviously very important for the mechanical breakdown, and so obviously if you've ever had any issues with your teeth, you know that it can be a big problem if you're missing teeth or you have a toothache or anything else, and it makes it so you don't want to eat anything. Well, in humans, we have a whole set of different types of teeth, both uppers and lowers, okay? And we get our teeth very early on. So we have primary teeth that start as 20 teeth from about 6 months to about when we're 6 years old when we start losing our teeth, okay? Underneath those primary teeth, we have secondary teeth, which we call the adult teeth. And so we actually have 32 of them. And so typically in our baby teeth, we stop at the first or second molar, and then that's all we have. But then our secondary teeth come in, and then we get our wisdom teeth. We get the second set of molars and things like this. And so we get a few more teeth that then we have from our baby teeth, okay? The three types of teeth that we have the incisors, which are the very front ones. These are the blue teeth here. So these are the incisors. These are used for biting and cutting things. And so you bite things and you might cut them to shred them and things like this. And people use this to open packages and things like that, even though they're not going to eat it. But that's one of the things that you use your incisors for. The second ones are the canines. These are the very sharp, pointy teeth that you have. These canine teeth help tear and grasp things. And so again, you associate that with like a dog or maybe a wolf or even a vampire. Those are the real pointed teeth that people had. Now, we don't bite into people and drink blood, but again, the canines represent the ones that are used for tearing and grasping things. So think of it, if you were going after and grabbing an animal and you were going to eat into it and bite it down. Maybe sometimes you're so hungry that you get that hamburger and you're like, "Arr," and you want to grind it down. And that is your canines. The last set of teeth are your molars, and the molars are flattened and they're very large, and the reason for that is that they're very good at crushing things and grinding things. And so typically what you do is when you eat something, you bite down, you tear it up, so you make it into smaller pieces, and then the molars are used to chew and break it down into smaller pieces that you can eventually swallow. And so along with the saliva that has some amylase in it and some other things, it starts breaking down the food that you eat, okay? This just kind of gives you a quick rendition of what the tooth looks like. And again, I'm not going to spend too much time on what these things are and everything, but you have the crown, which is the top part of the tooth, and then the root. And again, the enamel is the outside protection layer, and you have the gum that's associated with it. When you have too much sugar or too many bacteria, they eat away at the enamel by the acids that they produce. They can cause holes. If that hole goes all the way to the pulp or the root, that's when you get the carie, the dental carie, or the cavity that you feel, and that becomes painful because the nerve that runs in the root is actually exposed, and that's what you feel. And so typically you don't feel that, and so until you have a hole from the outside, and it's that outside air and stuff getting caught in there that causes the pain, and that's what you feel. And so you know when the cavity is pretty deep when you start feeling severe pain in your mouth. Okay, so that's a little rendition of the teeth. And so the three types: you have the incisors, the canines, and then finally the molars in your mouth. Okay, now another important structure of the mouth are the salivary glands. Now the salivary glands are made up of actually three pairs of glands. You have the parotid gland, which sits kind of in the back of the jaw here, okay, and that has a little duct that releases saliva to the top into the roof of your mouth. You have the submandibular gland, which kind of sits under your lower jaw, under here, and you can sometimes feel that. And then you have the sublingual gland, which actually sits under the tongue. Now, all these glands are called excretory glands because basically they're excreting stuff out into the open. So they're not secreting saliva into the bloodstream, so we call these exocrine glands or excretory glands. Release them out, and we talked about glands last time. These release enzymes and saliva that help start the chemical process of digestion in the mouth itself, okay? And so those are the three glands. And so what they do is they make saliva, which is loaded with enzymes, and begin the process. One of the most important enzymes is amylase. Amylase helps break starch down into glucose and maltose. And so you start that process already in your mouth, okay? So the next step that your body takes is basically going and pushing the food with the tongue and swallowing and then putting it into the back of the throat called the pharynx. And the pharynx is basically the back of your mouth and leading to into the top of the oral cavity. Now you actually have three parts to your pharynx. You have the nasopharynx, which is the nostrils, where the nostrils come in and join in with the mouth. You have the oropharynx, which is the back of the mouth, and then you have the hypopharynx, which is really below where the mouth and tongue sit. And so again, once you eat something, the tongue pushes the food back, it loads up into here, And what you have is this thing called the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is a covering that protects the larynx and the voice box and the trachea from food going down. What it is basically a little door that keeps the food to go down the esophagus and not down your trachea. So when the food is passed down, this closes down to protect the larynx and trachea. You then swallow the food and again keep the airway open. As soon as you pass the food, this flips back open and now you can breathe again into your lungs. Okay? The epiglottis is the muscular flap used to cover the opening of the trachea and again used when swallowing food or liquids. And the same thing happens when you drink something. You drink it, the epiglottis closes, the food and liquid go down, and as soon as that passes, this opens back up and you can breathe again. Okay, so it's impossible to try and breathe and drink at the same time because it's just not going to happen. And if you do, sometimes when you try and do both, that's when you start to cough because you get water or liquids down in the trachea and you're trying to get it out of your lungs. And so that's what you do when you cough. You cough and that actually comes out of the trachea, and that's the coughing reflex or the gag reflex that you have. Okay. Now, past the larynx, you have the esophagus, and this is a muscular tube that uses peristalsis to move the food to the stomach. Now, peristalsis is simply muscle contractions that are used to squeeze the food. So think of it, if you had a tube of toothpaste and you start at one end, and you want to get all the toothpaste at the end and out of the tube. And so what you do is you squeeze it all the way down. And essentially that's what your esophagus does. It takes the food at the top and it slowly squeezes all the way down until the food makes it to the stomach. Okay, and that's called peristalsis. It's an involuntary muscle contraction. You have no control over it. Your body does this using the brainstem. It's a wave-like motion. So what you can see is you get this area of constriction, and it breaks it down where the area of relaxation, as it moves down, it keeps squeezing, keeps squeezing, keeps squeezing, and finally the food makes it down to the stomach. Now, the food mixed with saliva is now no longer called food, but it's now known as the bolus, and the bolus works its way down until it reaches the stomach. Now, at the bottom of the esophagus, you actually have a sphincter. It's called the pyloric sphincter, and what it does is it protects the esophagus from getting any acid juices up into the esophagus. Now, you guys that suffer from heartburn, you're going to know, especially when you eat a spicy meal or something, what happens is acid actually leaks through the pyloric sphincter and you actually get acid into the esophagus, and that's that burning sensation that you feel and that keeps you up at night. And so that's the one thing, okay? And so we'll look at that as well. So I guess I'm sorry, it's the esophageal sphincter. The pyloric is farther down, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay, so the stomach is the next thing. This is a J-shaped organ, very muscular. And its basic function is the combination of storage, mixing, and digestion, and then finally release. And so you can see this very muscular, has a lot of internal folds, and those folds allow for the expansion of your stomach. Now, a lot of you have probably heard people where they get that surgery to actually reduce the size of the stomach, and what they do is they basically either put a clamp on the stomach so it can't expand, or what they do is they take this part of the esophagus and move it down here so that the stomach is actually very small. And what it's supposed to do is then keep you from eating too much food and actually force you to lose weight. And that's called that bariatric surgery. And so what they do is remove a lot of the stomach to shrink it down. Now, the stomach can actually expand pretty large, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So what is responsible? The stomach releases acid and the enzyme pepsin. The hydrochloric acid lowers the pH, and the reason why it does that is to inhibit and destroy bacteria that you may have swallowed when you've eaten that food that you've cooked. Okay. The pepsin is the enzyme that works at very low pH and works at digesting the proteins and breaking those down. And like I said, these rugae, you can see all these folds, are a series of folds that allow for expansion of the stomach. So your stomach has about 1 liter capacity, and so if you think about that, you have this muscle, or this hollow muscle that will expand and get larger. And so when you eat a big heavy meal, that thing is going to be very solid, and that's sometimes why you feel like it just kind of sits in your stomach, because your stomach is so expanded that it just has nowhere to go because you ate so much stuff, it's just so full. And that's that feeling of full. Basically, your stomach sends a signal to the brain saying, stop eating, stop eating because you're too full, and so you get that sense. But sometimes we eat too much before that message gets to our brain, and then you really feel it, and you're just like, man, I'm hurting. I did it to myself too badly, and now I'm going to be paying the price for the next couple of hours. Okay, and that's because the stomach can only expand so much. All right, so the next thing that we have is the small intestine. The small intestine is about 23 feet long. So if I took your small intestine and stretched it out, it'd be a very long tube. It's about 2.5 to 3 centimeters in diameter, about this size in diameter, so it's not very large, and it's actually broken down to 3 areas. You have the duodenum, which is basically that first turn in the small intestine. You have the jejunum, which is the top part of the small intestine, and then you have the ileum, which is the lower third of the intestine. Okay, and then you move into the large intestine, and again, we'll talk about the large intestine here in just a minute. Now, the small intestine, the important thing about the small intestine is this is where most of digestion and absorption takes place of the food. Okay, if you're going to digest it and again absorb it, you're going to do it in the small intestine. This is where most of the absorption takes place. Okay, you have enzymes like maltase, sucrase, and lactase, which help break down sugars and break them down to the glucose that you need to fire up your cells. And then again has a very basic pH because again it releases different things like sodium bicarbonate and other things to regulate the pH, so that again it goes from a very acidic pH, which is in the stomach, to a very basic pH, which is now found in the intestines itself. And so again, different enzymes work in different areas and things like that. And again, the last thing I wanted to point out is that the intestine is just not a solid tube. If I took a piece of your intestine and actually cut it, you can see that you have all these little tube-like things sticking out. And here's a great picture showing you an electron microscope of someone's intestine. You can see you have all these things called villi, and villi allow you to increase the surface area. And what these things do is they kind of move around to help move digestion, but it also gives you a lot more surface area so that you can absorb more materials. The more surface area they have, the more efficient you are, the better off you're going to be in absorbing things. And so this is really a kind of a cool picture showing you the villi and again the bacteria that grow on it. And again, bacteria have a very important role in here and help aiding digestion and help providing some vitamins and nutrients that you need for digestion to take place. Okay? The last part of the main part or the primary part is the large intestine. Now the large intestine is primarily responsible for the absorption of water and any other minerals that you might not have gotten in the small intestine. It's also responsible for your removal of waste material, and it's roughly about 4 to 5 feet long, okay, in that sense. And so it's not as long as the small intestine, but it's much larger in diameter, and it's roughly about 6 to 8 centimeters in diameter, okay? Very important for absorbing the water and that stuff. You have lots of bacteria that are in there. It contains enormous amounts of bacteria, over about 700 species, including E. coli in your large intestine. And again, it aids in digestion and producing vitamins that your body needs. The last thing I wanted to mention was that a lot of times you hear about this thing called the appendix. Now here's the small intestine. The small intestine comes into the large intestine, and you can see just below that you have what is called the appendix. It's kind of like the little tail that's on the large intestine. Now, we really don't have any idea what this appendix does. Now, some people have some ideas that maybe it was one of these things that we used when we were back in the days of hunters and gatherers, and we ate sticks and twigs and leaves and things like that, and maybe had some idea of harboring some bacteria that were very good in breaking some of that stuff down. But we really don't know what the function is. I mean, there really isn't one that we utilize today in our day and age and that stuff. The one issue that does happen is that people do develop appendicitis. And appendicitis is basically when this gets very inflamed and gets enlarged. And so if you don't get that treated, what can happen is this thing can rupture, this appendix can rupture and leak the bacterial material from the intestine into your open body cavity. Now that open body cavity is actually sterile, and all that bacteria gets in there. You can get a serious bacterial infection called peritonitis, and that peritonitis can be serious and can be deadly if you don't get treated in time. And so a ruptured appendix can be life-threatening if you don't get it served or fixed in time. And so what they do during the surgery is they go in, they remove the appendix, sew it up, and then you never have a problem again. And again, people live just normal lives even if they don't have an appendix and that stuff. But again, typically you don't want to do any surgery, so that's why we don't remove it unless you're really sick. But again, it can lead to serious infection and serious problems if it does become inflamed and enlarged and that. And so that's where that is, at the bottom of the large intestine. It's kind of like the tail of the large intestine there. All right. Now the last part is the rectum and anus, and that is basically the last part of the large intestine. And there are a couple of different sphincters there that help move the food out. And so basically you have these peristaltic waves that go through your body, and a lot of times what will happen as soon as you eat something, you'll get the peristaltic waves that travel throughout your whole digestive system that signal, okay, I've just put something in, now something has to come out. So a lot of times what will happen is people will eat something, have a nice good meal, and then immediately after they feel like they need to go and have the urge to go to the bathroom. And that's typically what happens because you get these peristaltic waves that say, okay, we want to have enough room for the stuff that's coming in, time to get rid of the other stuff. Now, a lot of times you're in a situation where you can't use the bathroom at that point, so a lot of times we'll sit there and hold it, you know, kind of grin and bear it until we have an option to do that. Well, what can happen sometimes is if you ignore those waves, what can happen is the feces can actually go back up into the large intestine where more and more water gets taken out. And so what it can lead to is blockages called constipation. And so that's basically because you get it so hard and so non-liquid and very hard stool that it blocks the passageway. And so it becomes very tough to pass when now you do have time to use the restroom and be able to pass the feces out. And so that can be a severe issue, especially if you're dehydrated, because you pull out more water. The more dehydrated you are, the less water you have. And so your body's trying to save as much water as it can, so it affects how hard your stool is, so that can be an issue. Also, obviously, in situations where if you can't go regularly, that can cause constipation and lead to other problems as well. And so typically, a normal human body should have at least one bowel movement a day and have a normal passing of feces and that stuff. And if you're not at that one bowel movement a day, you probably should look into something and see maybe you need to take more fiber, drink more water, and do those things, because normally you should have one about once a day. Okay, if you have too many in one day, that can be a whole nother issue, and you might want to cut back on the fiber, on the water, and you might have some diarrheal issues with that, and that can be a whole nother can of worms to get into. Okay, but that's to kind of give you an idea of a healthy system and what they should be doing. Now, the second thing we're going to look at is the secondary structures, and I already mentioned them. This is the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder. And these are all important organs that not necessarily are directly involved in digestion, but they provide a number of enzymes and products that they secrete to allow for digestion to occur. Now, the first one is the pancreas. And again, we talked about the pancreas before in the endocrine system. So if you watched that video, you heard my spiel about the pancreas and secreting insulin and things like that. The pancreas is also very useful and very helpful in secreting enzymes and that into the small intestine used for digestion. And so the pancreas is a digestive gland. It sits behind the stomach and on the side of the small intestine. So you can kind of see, here's the stomach sitting over the pancreas. And so if you're ever looking for your pancreas, it's sitting right behind your stomach. And again, there's a duct that runs all the way through the pancreas that then attaches to the duct that leads to the small intestine. And again, it provides enzymes and other material that's used in digestion. Contains things like trypsin, lipase, which breaks down fats, and amylase, which breaks down starches, and again helps break down proteins, fats, and starches in the body. And again, big producer of insulin, which regulates the amount of glucose in the blood. And so I've already mentioned this before about diabetes and that if you watch the endocrine system. So if you haven't yet, I definitely want to watch that video and talk about type 1, type 2. But the pancreas is involved in secreting insulin, which regulates how much glucose is in your blood. And too much glucose is a bad thing that leads to diabetes and other problems like that. So make sure you watch the endocrine so you have an idea about what those things are. A second structure that we talk about is the liver. This is obviously the largest organ that we have in the body, and if you guys remember from the digestion of the frog, it seemed like half the diet or the half of what was on the inside of the frog was liver and liver lobes. And again, we have 3 lobes of our liver. We have the right, left, and there's actually another piece that sits underneath. We actually have 3 lobes of our liver. And we see this thing, the right is obviously much larger because, again, it kind of sits over the small and large intestine, where the left has to make room for the stomach and the pancreas and things like this. Now, it detoxifies the blood. It stores glucose as glycogen. However, the most important thing for digestion with the liver is that it's the producer of bile. It helps split the fat into small droplets. It produces 800 to 1,000 mils of bile a day. And the other thing that is produced is this bilirubin, and bilirubin gives the bile its green color. Now, when you have a problem with your liver, one of the first things that people will see is that you get a yellowing of your skin and your eyes. Now, that's due to the excess bilirubin that's not going into the bile, but it's actually being released in the liver into the blood. And so when you see that, people get what is called jaundice. And so that jaundice represents some kind of problem that you're having with your liver, whether you have hepatitis that's affecting the liver, so that would be infection and inflammation of the liver. You could have cancer of the liver, which causes those things, or cirrhosis, which is damage to the liver due to alcohol or other toxins that you take. So it's not just alcohol that can cause cirrhosis, but it's other drugs, because the liver is responsible for detoxifying any of the drugs that you put into your body every day. So if you take a lot of aspirin, you take a lot of ibuprofen, you take a lot of these different things, you can do damage to your body, not only to your digestive system, but the accessory organs as well, especially the liver, which is responsible for detoxifying. Okay, and you can see here, this just shows you how bile works, and we saw this before in the lab this week. You guys are going to do this with the fat again. You take the fat globule, you add the bile salts, and you can see what it does is it breaks the fat down into smaller pieces, which allows it to mix with the water, and that's what bile does. It helps digestion by getting the fat into the water. Okay. The last one is the gallbladder, and I think this is where most people get confused about what the gallbladder does. The gallbladder is actually a small little accessory, kind of like a holding tank, sort of say. Okay, the liver itself is responsible for making the bile, but the gallbladder stores the bile until it's ready to be used by the small intestine. And so most people know about the gallbladder because they've heard of someone that had gallbladder surgery or had gallstones, which can be very painful, and have it removed. Now, those people live normal lives. The only difference is that most of the time the doctor will say avoid fatty food. And the reason for that is because you're limited in how much bile you can store. Because you lose that ability to store that bile and have it, you can't as easily break down fats as someone that has a fully functioning gallbladder. And so that's one of the reasons why the doctor will say, now that your gallbladder is removed, you need to avoid the fatty food. Okay, and that's one of the reasons. Now, a lot of people ask, what are gallstones? And gallstones are essentially cholesterol and other material that starts to get solid, that forms these crystals inside the gallbladder, and they form what are these stones. And you can see here's a picture of someone's gallbladder, and they're full of these gallstones. So this obviously would be someone that needs to get their gallbladder removed. The gallbladder sits underneath the liver, and you're going to see that in the models this week, that it actually sits underneath. You flip the liver over under the right lobe, and you're going to see this little green bulb, and that green bulb is the gallbladder, and again, that holds the bile. Now, people that have these large crystals or gallstones can block the bile duct, and that can be a serious issue. You get severe pain with that. You get jaundice because, again, the bilirubin doesn't go into the bile. It starts getting into the blood. So people start to get yellowing of the skin and eyes. It can lead to nausea. Can lead to blockage of the pancreas. So then you get pancreatitis, which is basically inflammation of the pancreas, which can be very painful. Can lead to a lot of things. So if you have this severe pain and you go to the doctor and he says, yep, you need to get your gallbladder removed, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll go in, they'll remove the gallbladder using arthroscopic surgery. So basically they just take a little thing, make 1 and 2 incisions into your belly, and then pull the gallbladder out, and then you go and live a normal, healthy life. And so again, this is when you have serious issues, serious complications with gallstones. A lot of times it's diagnosed with pain and sometimes with jaundice and that stuff. And so if you have some of these lower abdominal pains that you kind of get, you might want to have yourself checked out to see if maybe you have gallstones in that situation. And again, it can be a normal thing, but you just make lots of these things over time and they can lead to blockages. Okay, so we've come to the end of our lecture, and to summarize, the digestive system is used to process, digest, and absorb nutrients needed for metabolism. There are both the complete and incomplete system. You can think of the incomplete system as basically the mouth opens to a gut, then that mouth also acts as the anus, and that everything, all the waste gets excreted out that same opening, whereas the complete has two openings. You have the mouth and you have the anus, and you have the full digestive system. Again, the simpler animals like the Cnidaria and the Planaria have incomplete systems, where more multicellular, more developed animals have the complete system. We saw this in the earthworm, saw it in the crayfish, and we saw it in the frog. Complete systems where you have a mouth and the anus. Now, the primary digestive organs and tissues include the mouth, the teeth, the salivary glands, the pharynx, the esophagus, stomach, small and large intestine, where the secondary digestive organs contain the pancreas, liver, and gallbladder. So now you're probably asking, so what do I need to know for the test? Well, really on the test, what we want you to know is where these things are located, can you identify them on the models, things like that, what they look like, and what major function do they have. And so what I would do is go through, be able to identify on using either pictures or diagrams or whatever, where these things are located and what do they do. Okay, and again, you don't have to know everything and everything, just the major functions of what they do. And again, what I talked about in this lecture, that's what we want you to know. So don't worry about things that if you read somewhere and you're like, oh, that's kind of interesting, you're not going to have to know it. If we didn't talk about it here, don't worry about it. Okay? And again, if you have any questions, any problems or anything with these lectures, please let me know. Send your questions to me or Jill on an email, or talk to me in the lab. And again, take a good look at these things. You're going to have to see them again, especially if you're going on into A&P. You're going to have to study these things in probably more detail and their functions and structures. This is just trying to give you an early observation of all these different systems. And with that, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.